This is a really, this panel is a fascinating one, interests me greatly. It's about how can social media be used as a tool to investigate and prosecute atrocity crimes. I remember about 10 years ago, Sarah Sewell at the Carr Center at Harvard put out something called the Marrow Project, and it had something called the power of witness, and talked about how new digital technologies could be used in this manner to change people's behavior in conflict zones, and it's really taken off, and we're seeing the UN Office for Prevention of Genocide starting to work on this. We're seeing all sorts of NGOs and think tanks really do some really interesting things. So I think this is going to be a fascinating discussion. I'm going to pass the floor to John Packer, and John is a professor at University of Ottawa, and his Center for Research and Education on Human Rights is one of the partners of this year's Right City Conference. So John, I'd like to pass the floor to you to introduce speakers and carry on the conversation.
Well, thanks a lot for that kind of introduction, and also to the organizers. This is a really fascinating, riveting, so many of the sessions. Today, now we have the sixth principal session and penultimate session in the Right City Conference on social media as a tool to investigate and prosecute atrocity crimes. Yeah, a lot is happening in this field. I have to say, from my own background, I'm speaking to you now from the University of Ottawa, where I'm the Neuberger Jessen Professor of International Conflict Resolution in the Faculty of Law and Director of the Human Rights Center, as you mentioned. But I spent quite a bit of my career, and I started actually, or almost started, my career investigating human rights violations in a number of situations in Iraq, Myanmar, and Afghanistan in the early 1990s. And for those of you who might find it difficult to imagine, in the younger generation, there was no internet at that point. It was just being created actually in Geneva. And there were a lot of these questions, but how investigations were conducted, the means, and some of the old standard gems of evidence and so forth were important. I remember visiting, I'll just say quickly, I remember visiting Myanmar for the first time, I think it was in early 1993, and they had just installed a few satellite discs for telecommunications, but there were a total of 50 hardline telephone lines connecting the entire country. That was the means of at least telecommunication information at that time. So a lot has changed, and what we have now is a really great panel. I can't think of three better people to speak about really on the cutting edge and the state of the art now about investigations using social media, which of course has just been through leaps and bounds growing. And we're going to hear about how that's done, what are some of the issues involved, and try and reflect on how this can be used. Of course, I have to say one of the challenges is we're still facing a lot of problems about venues where this can be pursued. Nonetheless, the panel begins with our first speaker, Nick Waters. I'll introduce the panelists as they speak with their initial presentations. Nick Waters is a senior investigator at Bellingcat, which is itself a product of the development of these telecommunications, and a fascinating group. Nick's background was in the British military before he did some postgraduate studies and began working at Bellingcat. For those who don't know, Bellingcat is an independent international collective of researchers, investigators, and citizen journalists using open source and social media to probe a lot of these subjects. So Nick, we'll listen for your initial remarks.
So I'll kind of start from the most basic principles about why this is so important, or why the subject is so important. So many people around the world today are basically walking around with a tracking device, which can take pictures and videos and then upload it to a network, the internet. And that's a kind of capability that is still relatively new, kind of like 10, 15 years old. And when you combine it with certain human behaviors, it results in a whole new range of information that we have access to. So it's a natural human inclination to want to film the world around us and to take pictures or videos of interesting stuff. And that includes things like, say, conflict or atrocities. If something happens in front of people, say it's a terrorist attack or an airstrike, lots of people will run away, lots of people will hide, but there's always a small group of people who will pull out their phones and take pictures and videos of that event as it takes place. And although to a certain extent people may see this some kind of almost voyeuristic idea, there's a very strong urge to bear witness to the world around us that really comes out in these kind of events, because people will risk their lives to take images and videos and post about events that are affecting them and their community. And because we're humans, we're naturally gregarious, we want to share those experiences that we've experienced with everybody else. These images and videos of those kind of events get posted online, on social media, on closed WhatsApp groups, on multiple different messaging apps, and then eventually emerge on the internet. And a lot of these get posted, say, for example, Twitter or Facebook, and these aren't just social media applications. These are some of the most powerful information networks that humanity has ever created. So I think it's incredibly important that we leverage it in order to investigate these kind of events. And because of these because of these images and text posts and videos being posted on social media, for every physical event that takes place, there is a digital ripple. There's a ripple in the digital world as well. A few months ago, we had a mock hearing where we tested the admissibility of one of these videos, where we didn't know who had taken it, but we could demonstrate, or we were confident that we could demonstrate that video demonstrated the event in question, or showed the event in question, which is an airstrike in Sana'a in Yemen. And yeah, as I said, this information is incredibly important. We're confident and we're working towards a point where it can be used in court. And I think Alex Koenig will speak about that far better than I ever will. And I'll leave you with one last point, which is that if we are going to be using this information, we need to make sure that that's done properly. And we need to understand, how we can actually use it without potentially compromising it as evidence in a justice and accountability setting. Cool. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Nick, for that initial kind of entree for all of us into this burgeoning field, and some of the challenges you've already outlined, some of those that I'm sure our next speakers will address. So our second speaker is Stephanie Barbour. She's a senior advisor on sexual and gender-based violence at the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, which is an NGO that was created a few years ago, essentially for this kind of work. She's a lawyer, educated in Ireland and the US. Just a word or so on the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, which was founded by Bill Wiley. It's a non-profit, non-governmental entity dedicated to furthering criminal justice efforts through investigations, I would say international criminal justice efforts, in order to prevent the loss and destruction of vital evidence. So that point that Nick was just talking about, for the purposes of supporting prosecutorial efforts and ending impunity, whether at the domestic or international level, but I think focused most on the international level. Okay, Stephanie, you have the airwaves.
Thank you, John, for the kind introduction, and greetings from Ireland. My organization, the Commission, or CJA, as we call it, carries out the work you just described, and is best known so far for doing so in relation to gathering evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and in some cases genocide in relation to the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Syria and the reign of Islamic State in northern Iraq and Syria. Our approach has been to gather evidence that might otherwise be lost and preserve it for prosecutions, as you said, but also to prepare case files that examine the leadership structures that perpetrate the crimes, as well as the incidents and the patterns of crime. We are probably best known for doing so through a model of training national investigators who work on the ground to collect battlefield evidence, in particular original documents that help us to analyze the structure and authority of the perpetrating organizations and entities, and to situate individual perpetrators within those structures. That analysis led us to start gathering all of the IS documents, materials on slavery, and treating it as evidence rather than just information, because much of it proved to be very relevant and probative indeed. The substantive analysis showed us that IS was writing down their policies of enslaving Yazidis and sometimes Christians and Shia women as well. And that helped to convince us to proceed with our ground investigation, confident that there would be more documents that we would find in the field. And indeed there were. Our field investigators uncovered decisions of the IS Delegated Committee, the so-called cabinet of the caliphate, as well as orders from IS-run Sharia courts that, implied the transfer of ownership of humans as if they were nothing more than cattle. We, of course, had to put everything through a very strict verification protocol, particularly the online materials, to weed out less trustworthy sources. Some of which more often make the headlines because of the very sensational content, but which we may have doubts about.
It's my pleasure to invite our third speaker, Dr. Alexa Koenig, who's the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center at the University of California, Berkeley. She is also a lawyer, a scholar, a practitioner. She's the co-founder of the Human Rights Center Berkeley's Investigations Lab. She's been widely recognized and received a number of awards. For those of you who are less familiar with, for example, the Human Rights Center at the University of Berkeley, it's itself quite renowned, led for, I think, a quarter century now by Eric Stover, who was himself very much involved in investigations in the early 1990s relating to, as part of Physicians for Human Rights, relating to crimes in former Yugoslavia in particular. So there's a pedigree for the center. And I've had the pleasure, Alexa, to work with the center and some of your former colleagues, Lauren Fletcher and others. Outstanding center. So, Dr. Koenig, please share your initial remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I'm thrilled to be in conversation with you and with Stephanie and Nick. And this is such a collaborative space, and a space that is growing and changing so quickly that I think it really does depend on people with very different perspectives on this work and bringing that together to make the work as strong as possible. As you just mentioned, we have been around for about 25 years on the Berkeley campus. We are technically based in the School of Law, but we consider ourselves a multidisciplinary center. The advantage of that is really being able to bring together people from practice of law, with journalism, computer science, public health, etc., to look at issues of common human rights concern or concern regarding atrocity crimes more broadly. As a research center, we sent one of our PhD students to the court who spent a summer there, and she came back and said, look, what the judges are ultimately saying is one of the challenges is that the prosecution is over-relying on what was then considered, and is still considered, open source information, but more traditional forms of it, like NGO reports or media stories. And that the judges were saying that's not primary evidence. You really need to bring in additional materials. This past December, we launched the Berkeley Protocol on Digital Open Source Investigations in an advanced English version with the United Nations. We will be releasing the formal version this summer, along with a version of it in every language of the UN. And we also have a few organizations that have offered to translate the protocol into additional languages. And I know I'm running short on time, so I'll just quickly say, I think what we were hoping for with this set of guidelines was to establish a floor, a minimum set of practices, so that people who are working on these spaces or looking to incorporate online open source investigations into their daily practice would have some understanding of where to start. However, because it sets minimum standards and not necessarily best practices, and because it's largely tool agnostic, meaning we don't mention specific tools you can do to do this work because they change so quickly in digital practice, we made it tool agnostic. So organizations do still need to develop SOPs or standard operating practices for incorporating these methodologies. We helped the ICC and have helped others to develop those SOPs. And now I think are looking at developing additional research that can help complement some of what we have in the protocol. We have a special issue, which I might get a chance to talk about later, in the Journal of International Criminal Justice coming up, where Nick has a piece on how to work with these methodologies. I have a couple of pieces coming out on using open source information for investigating sexual and gender-based violence related crimes, one there, and in a book chapter, which I actually think provides some practical suggestions for how we can strengthen that. And I think with that, since I'm out of time, I will leave it there and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
So when I used to investigate in person on the ground, international human rights violations, serious human rights violations, and taking testimony, for example, or collecting documentation and so forth, there is a serious question about consent and the expectation of persons to give that consent with the expectation that something will follow from it. I mean, I'm struck by the recent confirmation of General Mladic's criminal culpability a full quarter century after the events occurred. And I wonder, just as you just mentioned, in the case of, a victim of rape, if one says, well, share this information, very delicate, very prejudicial socially, and something might happen in a quarter century. How does one navigate this kind of, I would say, dilemma?
I think it's a very pertinent question. I mean, again, we may not be talking about asking a victim to consent to reliance as evidence on a video or audio file that depicts actual sexual violence. Very rarely do we have it. And I think most investigators, certainly myself, would balk at using it because of the very real protection and well-being concerns that would raise for victims or survivors. But for example, there could be other types of material, such as in the case of Islamic State, they have often produced and sent out ransom videos, ransom photographs for enslaved women and children that they are trying to sell back to their families and their communities. And we sometimes receive those.
Yeah, so it's quite, it's a little bit more complex than I think most people would think about or would consider. Like the kind of initial point that we work from is that if someone's posted this, or if an image or video has been posted online in the open, then we're allowed to use that. That's our base point at which we start. However, the considerations that we take into account when we use it may change. Because if someone posts an image or a video online on their small account that has 30 followers and they don't believe it's going to be picked up by like a large organization, say for example New York Times or Bellingcat, they may not expect or like the fact that it has been. So that should certainly be taken into account when doing this kind of research. And I think if you believe that someone is the original author of a piece of content, an image or a video, then all reasonable routes should be taken to get in contact with them and ask if it's possible to use that. However, the majority of the content that you see online, the majority of the images and videos that you see, primarily videos that you see, it's not possible to establish who originally filmed them. What generally happens is that an image or a video may be taken, it will be posted within, say, a person's immediate network, then that will get posted on WhatsApp groups, Telegram groups, private groups, and then it'll start getting posted on Twitter or Facebook. So by the time it reaches Investigator, it will have gone through multiple different iterations and will be virtually impossible to establish who actually took that image or that video. And at that point, you're in a bit of an ethical quandary because you have no idea who actually filmed this stuff. And I stress again, this is the majority of user-generated content that I've come across. Do you simply not use it because you cannot establish who actually originally created that content? especially if it shows something that is incredibly important. So, for example, the fact that an airstrike took place at a particular location, or potentially an execution.
One of the things that we are currently working on at the center and hope to be able to release some preliminary findings on soon is directly to this issue of consent. So we're creating an entire typology of what are the many ways in which the issue of consent arises in a digital open source investigation. And it turns out there are so many different areas where that comes up that it really would be more than I'd have time to fully and thoroughly address in the next minute or so. But I do want to put a pin in the fact that that is coming, and it is a very detailed analysis that brings in the law related to this, along with what we're seeing in terms of practice. As Nick mentioned, it's often information is often being handled by intermediaries. And I think even when it's going directly to investigators, knowing what the intermediary has said to the person who maybe produced the information is a big, tricky piece of this. I think it's further complicated in the sexual and gender-based violence context. If we think about rape, that is often partially defined as having had a lack of consent to the activity or to the crime that's been perpetrated. And so I think there's an additional sensitivity that comes up when investigating SGBV-related crimes around not wanting to further remove consent from the victim or survivor.
Well, thanks. That sounds great. That sounds like a great framework and over. And I'm looking forward to seeing what you'll come up with shortly in terms of the publication. Unfortunately, our time we've reached the limit, and I very much feel that we're barely scratched the surface of this burgeoning field and important field. I think, Kyle, perhaps you can guide us now on what our next steps are for the end of the day, because then I think tomorrow is the last day.
Yeah. So I'd just like to thank everyone. John, you did a wonderful job moderating. We're going to get you, but you came in right when we started, so fantastic. Alexa, Nick, and Stephanie, thank you for sharing your knowledge, your expertise. You're all doing such important work. We're hopefully, this is an annual conference. First time we've done it virtual, but hopefully we'll be able to have you in Canada sometime in the future to discuss this in person, but also in more informal settings as the conferences that we used to have. But we're really, really, really pleased to have you, and your work inspires us here in Montreal and across Canada, and we're hoping that this will lead to collaboration. Just one last note, we have one last panel taking place tomorrow. If anyone's interested, please join in at 12 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. It's a panel on confronting online hate, and we're going to have representatives of the United Nations, Facebook, and from different academic institutions, and the Global Action Against Mass Atrocity Crimes Initiative. So with that being said, thank you for joining us. Thank you, and please join us tomorrow.